"I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said. Mafia boss waited in the shadows to protect her. The espresso machine hissed one last time, a dying gasp of steam that matched exactly how Elena Ward felt. It was 10 minutes past closing at the Daily Grind, a small indie coffee shop tucked into the corner of 4th and Main in downtown Harborview. Outside, the city was draped in a thick, suffocating drizzle, the kind that turned the asphalt slick and made the neon signs of the nearby bars bleed across the pavement in blurry streaks of red and blue. Elena wiped down the granite counter with a rag that smelled of bleach and stale roasted beans. Her shoulders ached. It had been a double shift, followed immediately by a 3-hour evening lecture for her social work certification. Her feet throbbed inside her worn sneakers, but she kept scrubbing at a stubborn coffee stain, using the repetitive motion to drown out the silence of the empty shop. Silence was dangerous. Silence was when the memories came back. Her gaze drifted involuntarily to the small, laminated card taped discreetly to the side of the register, away from the customer's view. It was a memorial card. Ryan Ward, beloved brother and son. The date of death was exactly 3 years ago today. He'd been 19, just a kid. Elena squeezed the rag until her knuckles turned white. Ryan had not just died, he had been erased. He had been swallowed whole by the chemical poison that flooded Harborview's streets, a synthetic nightmare supplied by dealers who paid their tribute up the chain to the Rinaldi syndicate. To everyone else, Ryan was just another overdose statistic in a city rotting from the inside out. To Elena, he was the boy who used to leave half-eaten sandwiches on the counter and laugh with his whole chest. The bell above the door chimed, shattering her thoughts. Elena looked up, irritation rising in her throat. The sign on the door clearly said closed. She opened her mouth to tell them the register was shut down, but the words died on her tongue. 3 men walked in. They were not the usual late-night crowd of college students or tired nurses. They wore charcoal suits that cost more than Elena made in a year, tailored to hide the bulk of weapons beneath the fabric. They moved with a predatory synchronization, scanning the room before stepping aside. Then a 4th man entered. The air in the coffee shop seemed to drop 10 degrees. The ambient noise of the refrigerator hum and the rain against the glass faded into the background, suffocated by the sheer presence of the man who stepped through the door. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a terrifying, contained stillness. His coat was black wool, his collar turned up against the damp chill. Elena recognized him instantly. Everyone in Harborview knew his face, though usually it was grainy footage on the evening news or a photo accompanying a headline about dropped charges and missing witnesses. Dominic Rinaldi, the Silent King. He was the head of the family that had flooded her neighborhood with drugs. He was the reason Ryan was dead. Fear struck her first, a cold spike in her chest, followed immediately by a hot, blinding wave of anger. Her coworker, a college sophomore named Ben who was usually chatty, had gone completely still behind the pastry case, his eyes wide and fixed on the floor. Dominic walked to the counter, up close. He was even more imposing. His hair was dark, kept short and neat, and his eyes were the color of hardened steel, devoid of any obvious emotion. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a CEO or a politician, someone who commanded rooms by simply existing in them. That made it worse. It made the violence he represented feel calculated and efficient. Elena forced herself to stand her ground. She tossed the rag into the sanitizer bucket with a splash that sounded too loud in the quiet room. "We are closed," she said. Her voice was steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Dominic looked at her. His gaze was heavy, dissecting. He did not look at her body or her face in the way men usually did. He looked at her as if he were reading a file. "The door was unlocked," he said. His voice was a low baritone, smooth and startlingly polite. "I just need a black coffee. Nothing complicated." Elena wanted to scream at him. She wanted to throw the scalding water from the tea tap into his face. She wanted to ask him if he knew how many 19-year-old boys had died so he could buy that coat. Instead, She remembered the rent due in 2 days and the terrifying reality of who he was. If she provoked him, she would not just lose her job. People who annoyed the Rinaldis tended to lose much more. She turned her back to him without a word, grabbing a paper cup. Her hands were trembling, and she hated herself for it. She poured the dark roast, the liquid swirling black and bitter, and shoved a lid onto it. When she turned back, Dominic was watching her hands. She slammed the cup onto the counter. $2.50. Dominic reached into his coat pocket. He did not produce a wallet, just a money clip. Before he could pay, the door chimed again. This time, it was not a well-dressed predator. It was a man Elena had kicked out an hour ago, a local drunk named Greg who had been harassing customers for change. He stumbled in, wet and smelling of cheap whiskey and old sweat. "I told you," Greg shouted, slurring his words heavily. "I ain't leaving until I get a refund on that sandwich. It was stale." Elena's patience snapped. "Greg, get out! I am calling the police!" Greg lunged forward, ignoring the men in suits standing near the window. He reached across the counter and grabbed Elena's wrist, his grip surprisingly strong and greasy. "Don't you talk down to me, you little—" The air in the room shifted violently. Elena flinched, trying to yank her arm back, but before she could struggle, a shadow fell over them. Dominic Rinaldi had moved. He had not run. He had simply ceased to be where he was and was now standing directly beside Greg. He did not shout. He did not draw a weapon. He merely tilted his head, his eyes boring into the side of the drunk man's face. "Let go of her." The command was spoken at a normal volume, almost soft. It was the tone of a man who never had to repeat himself. Greg froze. He looked up, bleary-eyed, ready to fight. But the moment his eyes met Dominic's, the alcohol seemed to evaporate from his system, replaced by primal terror. Dominic's hand hovered near Elena's arm, ready to intervene, but he did not touch her. He simply existed in the space, radiating a lethal promise. Greg's fingers sprang open. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. I didn't know," Greg stammered, his face draining of color. "I didn't know she was with you." "She isn't with me," Dominic said, his voice devoid of inflection. "She is working, and you are leaving." Greg did not wait for a second invitation. He turned and scrambled out the door, slipping on the wet pavement outside before vanishing into the dark. Elena stood frozen, rubbing her wrist where Greg had grabbed her. The adrenaline was making her knees weak. She looked at Dominic, torn between the instinct to thank him and the revulsion of knowing who he was. He had saved her, yes, but he was also the architect of the hellscape that created men like Greg. "Thank you," she said, the words grinding out through her clenched teeth. Dominic turned his gaze back to her. For a second, the mask of indifference slipped. He looked at her, rubbing her wrist, and a frown touched his brow. Then, his eyes drifted past her shoulder. He was looking at the register, specifically at the laminated card taped to the side. Elena saw him read the name, Ryan Ward. She saw his eyes narrow slightly on the photo of her brother, a picture taken at high school graduation. Then, she saw him notice the detail she thought was hidden, the faint, jagged track marks she had drawn in black marker over the edges of the card one night in a fit of grief, a private acknowledgement of how he had really died. Something flickered across Dominic Rinaldi's face. It looked like pain. It looked like guilt. It was gone in a blink. He placed a $100 bill on the counter. "Keep the change," he said. He turned and walked out into the rain, his 3 guards falling into formation around him, leaving Elena standing alone in the silence, staring at the money as if it were blood. The walk home was always the worst part of the day. Elena lived in a 4th-floor walk-up in the East End, a neighborhood that had seen better decades, let alone better days. The streetlights were intermittent, buzzing with dying bulbs that cast long, erratic shadows against the brick buildings. Elena walked quickly, her keys protruding from between her knuckles like makeshift claws. The rain had slowed to a mist that clung to her eyelashes. Every footstep that echoed behind her made her heart hammer against her ribs. She felt exposed. She felt watched. She turned the corner onto her street, glancing over her shoulder. The street was empty. save for a few parked cars. She did not see the black sedan idling silently in the alleyway across from her apartment building. Inside the car, Dominic Rinaldi sat in the dark. The engine was off, the lights were killed, and the tinted windows made him invisible to the world outside. He watched Elena hurry up the steps to her building, fumbling with the heavy front door before slipping inside. Only when the light in the fourth-floor window flickered on did Dominic exhale. He looked down at the passenger seat. There was a manila folder there, worn at the edges. He did not need to open it to know what was inside. It was a dossier on a kid named Ryan Ward. Dominic remembered the boy. He remembered Ryan because he was one of the few Dominic had actually tried to pull out of the gutter. He had set up a discreet scholarship, a rehab placement fully paid for under a shell company's name. He had tried to cut the supply lines to the dealers on Ryan's block, but the machine Dominic had inherited from his father and uncle was too big, too hungry. The order to cut Ryan off had come too late. The product had already been sold. 3 years. He'd been watching over the sister for 3 years. It was a penance, a ghost he could not exorcise. "Drive," Dominic said to the driver, his voice raspy. The sedan pulled away, disappearing into the night like smoke. Elena sat at her small, chipped kitchen table. The apartment was cold. The radiator hissed, but produced very little heat. Spread out before her were the remnants of Ryan's life, the rejection letter from the community college, the intake forms for a rehab center he never made it to, and next to them, tonight's newspaper. She had circled the headline, "Harborview's Silent King, no charges filed in Port Authority, corruption case." Dominic's face stared up at her from the grainy newsprint. He looked untouchable, arrogant. "Men like you," she whispered to the empty room, her voice trembling with bitterness. "Men like you never pay. You break everything and you just walk away." She took a pair of scissors and stabbed them through the photo, pinning Dominic's face to the cheap wooden table. The next morning, the atmosphere at the daily grind was tense. The boss, a nervous man named Mr. Henderson, who sweated even when the air conditioning was on, was pacing back and forth. "Elena," he said, avoiding her eyes as she tied her apron, "we need to be careful. About who we upset." Elena frowned. "What are you talking about, Mr. Henderson pointed a shaking finger toward the tip jar on the counter. Elena walked over. Tucked underneath the glass jar was a folded piece of lined notebook paper. She pulled it out and unfolded it. The handwriting was jagged, hurried. "Stop asking questions about Ryan. Some people want you quiet." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She'd been asking questions. She'd been going to the police precinct every week for 3 months, demanding they reopen Ryan's case, insisting that the toxicology report didn't match the police narrative of a simple overdose. She'd been making noise. She crumpled the note in her fist. She looked at the door where Dominic had stood the night before. He came here to intimidate me, she thought, a cold fury settling in her stomach. That is why he was here. The coffee was just an excuse. He wanted me to know he can get to me. "It is fine, Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice deceptively calm. "I will handle it. Just let it go." "Elena, Mr. Henderson pleaded. "Please, these people, they don't play games." Elena turned away, throwing the note into the trash. "No, they don't, and neither do I." The shift dragged on for 8 hours, every minute filled with paranoia. Every time the door opened, Elena expected to see the suits again. When she finally clocked out, the sun had already set, plunging the city back into its habitual gloom. She practically ran home, gripping her pepper spray in her pocket. When she reached her apartment door, she stopped. The door was slightly ajar. The wood around the lock was splintered, raw and pale against the dark paint. The brass chain she always used hung limply, snapped in two. Elena pushed the door open with her foot, holding her breath. "Oh no," she whispered. Her apartment had been tossed. The drawers of her dresser were pulled out, clothes scattered across the floor. The cushions of her sofa had been slashed. The kitchen cupboards were open. Flour and sugar spilled over the linoleum, but her laptop was still on the table. The small television was still on its stand. This was not a robbery. This was a search. Elena stepped over a pile of books and knelt in the center of the living room. A cardboard shoebox, the one where she kept Ryan's letters from camp, his drawings, the few happy things she had left, had been dumped upside down. The papers were scattered everywhere. They were looking for something, she realized, terror finally piercing through her shock. They thought Ryan left something behind. She sat back on her heels, surrounded by the wreckage of her sanctuary, and for the first time in years, she felt truly, completely unsafe. High above the street, on the rooftop of the building directly opposite Elena's, the wind whipped at Dominic Rinaldi's coat. He stood near the edge, looking down at the window where the lights were blazing. He could see her silhouette moving through the chaos of the apartment. He could see her kneel on the floor. Beside him, his lieutenant, Nate, shifted uncomfortably. Nate was a big man, loyal to a fault, with a scar running through his left eyebrow. "We were too late," Nate said, his voice grim. "We missed them by 10 minutes. Dom, the neighbors said they saw 2 guys in maintenance uniforms leaving just as we pulled up. Dominic's jaw was set so hard a muscle feathered in his cheek. His hands were balled into fists at his sides, the leather of his gloves creaking. Did she see them?" Dominic asked. "No," Nate replied. "She just got home. She is alone in there." Dominic watched Elena stand up and move toward the window. She looked terrified. She looked small. He had spent 3 years keeping the wolves at bay. He had quietly paid off her landlord to keep her rent stable. He had ensured the streetlights on her block were fixed the same day they burned out. He had kept his own uncle's dealers 2 streets away from her apartment. And now, someone had touched her door. Someone had violated the one space she had left. Dominic turned away from the ledge, his expression hardening into something that made Nate take a subtle step back. "Find out who they were," Dominic said. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "We think it might be freelance," Nate said. "Maybe someone looking for a score, thinking the brother stashed cash." "No," Dominic cut him off. "This wasn't about cash. This was a message." He looked back at the window one last time. "Whoever thought they could use Ryan's sister to send me a message," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper, "just signed their death warrant." He buttoned his coat, put a detail on the lobby door, invisible. "If anyone other than her tries to walk into that building tonight, I want to know before they even touch the handle." "Got it," Nate said. Dominic walked toward the roof access door. He had tried to stay in the shadows. He had tried to protect her without her knowing, to spare her the burden of his existence. But the war was coming to her doorstep now. The shadows were no longer enough. The officer standing in the center of Elena's living room looked bored. He was a man in his late 40s with a receding hairline and a uniform that strained slightly around the middle. He clicked his pen. Once, twice, 3 times. A rhythmic annoyance that grated against Elena's already frayed nerves. "So, let me get this straight," Officer Miller said, looking around the apartment without truly seeing it. "Nothing was stolen. The laptop is right there. The TV is there. You said you had $50 in emergency cash in the drawer, and that is still there too." Elena stood with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, hugging herself to keep from shaking. "That is the point," she said, her voice sharp. "Someone broke in, tossed the place, and left without taking anything of value. That means they were looking for something specific, or they just wanted to scare me." Miller sighed, a long, heavy exhale that smelled faintly of onions and stale coffee. "Look, Miss Ward, junkies break into places all the time looking for pills or jewelry. Maybe they got spooked before they could grab the electronics. It happens. They broke the chain lock." Elena insisted. "That takes force. And they went through my brother's things, specifically his things." The mention of her brother. Miller's gaze drifted to the file on the table, the rehab paperwork, the autopsy report copies she kept, the old court summons. He picked up a sheet of paper, his eyes scanning the text. When he looked back at Elena, his expression had shifted from boredom to a condescending smirk. "Ryan Ward," Miller read aloud. "I remember this kid. We picked him up a few times for possession. Look, Miss Ward, if your brother owed people money, or if he was mixed up with the wrong crowd. Sometimes that trouble lingers. It is usually best not to stir the pot. Elena felt a flush of heat climb up her neck. It was not embarrassment. It was pure, unadulterated rage. Ryan had been gone for 3 years. He was 19 when he died, and this man was standing in her violated home, suggesting that Ryan, and by extension Elena, deserved this. "Are you going to take fingerprints?" Elena asked, her voice trembling with the effort to keep it steady. Miller chuckled dryly. "For a break-in where nothing was stolen? We don't have the budget for that, sweetheart. File a report with your landlord. Get a better lock." He dropped the paper back onto the table. It fluttered down, landing crookedly on Ryan's photo. "Have a good night, Miss Ward," Miller said, turning his back on her. Elena watched him leave, the heavy thud of her broken door closing behind him echoing like a gunshot. She was alone. The police were not going to help her. In Harborview, unless you had money or influence, the law was just a suggestion, and justice was a fairy tale. The anger did not dissipate overnight. It hardened. The next day, after a shift at the coffee shop where she dropped 2 mugs because her hands wouldn't stop shaking, Elena took the bus straight to the precinct. She wasn't going to let Miller's dismissal stand. She wanted to speak to a detective. She wanted someone to take this seriously. The precinct smelled of industrial cleaner and despair. Phones rang incessantly, and the fluorescent lights hummed with a headache-inducing flicker. Elena marched up to the front desk, her jaw set. "I want to speak to whoever is in charge of the burglary division," she told the desk sergeant. "Take a number and have a seat," the sergeant mumbled without looking up. Elena slammed her hand on the counter. "No. I filed a report last night and the officer treated it like a joke. Someone broke into my home. I want—" "Elena?" The voice came from the hallway to her left. Elena froze. She knew that voice. It was smoother than it used to be, deeper, but it still carried the same cadence that used to make her laugh when they were 20. She turned. Detective Ethan Cole was standing there, holding a styrofoam cup of coffee, and he looked good. He'd filled out since she last saw him 2 years ago, his shoulders broader, his blonde hair cut in a sharp, professional fade. He wore the badge on his belt like it belonged there. "Ethan," Elena breathed. He walked over, his expression a mix of surprise and something else, something guarded. He looked around the lobby quickly before stopping in front of her. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, keeping his voice low. "You okay?" Elena felt a sudden, pathetic surge of hope. Ethan was her ex. They hadn't ended well. He had prioritized the academy over everything else, and she had been drowning in Ryan's addiction. But he was a good guy. Or he used to be. "Someone broke into my apartment yesterday," Elena said, the words tumbling out fast. "They tossed everything but didn't steal anything." The responding officer, Miller. He barely looked at it. He saw Ryan's file and wrote it off as junkie drama. Ethan's face tightened. He looked down at his coffee cup, then back at her. His eyes didn't quite meet hers. They focused somewhere on her forehead. "I am sorry." "Elle," he said, "that sounds rough. I think it has to do with Ryan," she pressed, lowering her voice. "I have been asking questions. Ethan, about the overdose, about where the drugs came from, and then I get a threat at work, and my place gets tossed? That is not a coincidence." Ethan shifted his weight. He took a step back, his body language closing off. He crossed his free arm over his chest, creating a barrier between them. "Ryan has been gone a long time. Elena," he said softly. "Maybe Miller was right. Maybe it was just random. You know this city. It was not random," she insisted, searching his face for the concern she used to know. "Why are you acting like this? You used to care about what happened to him." "I do care," Ethan said, but the words sounded rehearsed. "Look, I will pull the report. I will look into it, okay? But you need to be careful. You start digging up old graves, you are going to get dirty. Just let it go, for your own sake." He checked his watch, a nervous tick she remembered from when he was lying about where he had been. "I have to get to a briefing," he said, backing away. "Go home, Elena. Lock your door." He turned and walked away fast, disappearing through the security doors without looking back. Elena stood in the lobby, the hope in her chest withering into a cold, hard knot. He was hiding something. She could see it in the way he refused to look her in the eye. The sun had set by the time she left the station. The alleyway that served as a shortcut to the bus stop was narrow and damp, lined with overflowing dumpsters that smelled of rot. Elena walked quickly, her keys laced between her fingers, her breath misting in the chill air. She was halfway down the alley when two shadows detached themselves from the wall ahead. Elena stopped dead. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. One of the men was huge, with shoulders that blocked out the streetlight at the end of the alley. She recognized him vaguely. He was the one who had been with Dominic at the coffee shop. Nate. "Miss Ward," Nate said. His voice was deep, gravelly, but surprisingly polite. Elena took a step back, her hand diving into her pocket to grip the canister of pepper spray. "Get out of my way. We just want to talk," Nate said, holding his hands out, palms up. "The boss wants a word. He thinks it would be better if we went somewhere safer." The boss? Dominic Rinaldi. Elena's fear spiked, hot and acidic. They were cornering her. This was it. This was how people disappeared in Harborview. "I am not going anywhere with you," she spat, pulling the pepper spray out and aiming it at Nate's face. "Back off, I swear to God. I will blind you." Nate didn't flinch. He just looked sad, like he was watching a kitten try to fight a Rottweiler. "Please don't make this difficult." "Miss Ward, I said back off," she screamed, her voice cracking. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from the shadows behind Nate. Dominic Rinaldi moved into the pool of dim, yellow light cast by the single working bulb above the service entrance. He looked different than he had in the coffee shop. He wasn't wearing the heavy wool coat. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, revealing the white dress shirt underneath and the lack of a shoulder holster. He held his hands up, slightly away from his body, showing her he was unarmed. "Put the spray away." "Elena," Dominic said. His voice was calm, low and steady. It cut through the panic in her brain like a knife. "You stay away from me," Elena yelled, away, shifting her aim toward him. "You sent them to my apartment. You were trying to scare me into silence." Dominic's expression darkened, his brows drawing together. "I didn't send anyone to your apartment. If I wanted to be in your apartment, I would have walked in through the front door and you would have made me coffee. I am not the one breaking your locks." "Liar," she shouted, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. "It is your drugs that killed my brother. It is your people who threatened me at work. And now you corner me in an alley? I am cornering you because you are running around the city, poking a stick at a sleeping bear," Dominic shot back, taking a step forward. His composure cracked just enough to show the frustration beneath. "I am trying to keep you alive. You killed him." Elena cried out, the grief she had been carrying for 3 years finally exploding out of her. "You killed Ryan, you and your poison. I did not kill your brother." Dominic's voice rose, echoing off the brick walls. The sound was thunderous, commanding silence. "My crew didn't supply that hit. We don't sell that garbage. I tried to help him." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Elena stared at him, her chest heaving. "You... what?" "I tried to help him," Dominic repeated, his voice dropping back to that intense, vibrating quiet. "I paid for the rehab. I tried to get him out, but he wouldn't go." "Liar," Elena whispered, but the air was suddenly too thin. Her lungs wouldn't expand. The alley began to tilt. The brick walls seemed to be closing in, rushing toward her. She gasped, a sharp, wheezing sound. The pepper spray slipped from her numb fingers and clattered onto the wet pavement. She swayed, her vision tunneling into a pinpoint of gray light. "Elena?" Dominic's voice sounded far away. She couldn't breathe. It was a panic attack, a bad one. Her knees buckled. She expected to hit the hard, dirty concrete. Instead, she hit something solid and warm. Dominic had moved with impossible speed. He caught her, his hands gripping her upper arms to keep her upright. "Breathe," he ordered. "I can't," she gasped, clawing at his shirt. "Yes, you can," he said. He shifted, moving closer until he was a wall of heat and stability against her shivering form. "Look at me." Elena forced her eyes open. The world was spinning, but Dominic's face was sharp, focused. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they were locked onto hers with an intensity that anchored her to the earth. "Match my breath," he said softly. He inhaled slowly, exaggerating the motion of his chest. Elena tried to mimic him, but her breath hitched in a sob. Again. Dominic murmured. He moved his hands from her arms to her shoulders, his palms heavy and warm. The weight was grounding. It told her body where it ended and the rest of the world began. In, out. He guided her through the rhythm, his patience infinite. Slowly, the black spots dancing in her vision faded. The walls of the alley stopped closing in. The cold dampness of the air returned, sharp against her skin. Dominic didn't let go. One of his hands slid up from her shoulder to the back of her neck. His thumb brushed over the sensitive skin there, a slow, deliberate stroke that felt electric. It was a gesture of comfort, almost tender, completely at odds with the violence of his reputation. Elena looked up at him. They were inches apart. She could smell him. Rain, expensive tobacco, and something clean like cedar. In the dim light, the monster faded. She saw the man. She saw a tiny, pale scar at the corner of his mouth, a flaw in his perfect armor. She saw the deep, etched lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the look of a man who carried the weight of the world and hated every ounce of it. For a heartbeat, one single, treacherous heartbeat, she felt a pull, a magnetic force drawing her toward the safety he offered. He felt safe. God help her. The mafia boss felt safe. The realization hit her like a bucket of ice water. Elena jerked back, gasping as if she had been burned. She scrambled away from him, her back hitting the brick wall. "Don't touch me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Do not ever touch me again." Dominic's hand fell to his side. The mask slammed back into place instantly. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by the cold, impassive face of the king of Harborview. "Go home, Elena," he said, his voice devoid of the warmth it held seconds ago. "Lock your door. And for God's sake, stop asking questions." He turned and walked into the darkness, his men following silently in his wake, leaving her alone in the alley with her heart pounding, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She should have gone home. She should have listened. But when she got back to her apartment, sitting on her slash sofa, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Last warning. Drop it. It was the timing. It was the arrogance. It was the assumption that she was weak, that she would fold, that she would let Ryan be forgotten. Elena stood up. She went to the bathroom and washed her face. She put on black jeans and the only nice blouse she owned, a dark silk shirt she had bought for a job interview she never got. She applied mascara with a steady hand, turning her fear into a cold, hard weapon. She was done being the victim. 40 minutes later, she stood in front of the Ember Line. It was a fortress of glass and steel overlooking the river, the crown jewel of Dominic Rinaldi's empire. The bass from the music inside thumped against the pavement, a heartbeat that shook the ground. Elena walked past the long line of hopefuls. She walked right up to the bouncer, a man the size of a vending machine. "I am here to see Dominic," she said. The bouncer looked her up and down. She didn't fit in. She wasn't wearing diamonds or a dress that cost more than a car. She looked like a social worker who had had enough. "He's busy," the bouncer grunted. "Tell him Elena Ward is here." She said, "Tell him if he wants me to stop asking questions, he can come tell me himself." The bouncer hesitated, then touched his earpiece. He murmured something, listened, and then stepped aside. "Third floor," he said. Elena walked in. The inside of the Ember Line was an assault on the senses. The lights were low and gold, casting everyone in a beautiful, decadent glow. The music was loud, a sensual, driving rhythm that seemed to vibrate in her teeth. The air smelled of expensive perfume and champagne. Elena felt small. She felt out of place, but she kept her chin up, navigating through the crowd of laughing, beautiful people who had no idea that their fun was funded by blood. "Hey, gorgeous." A hand grabbed her elbow. Elena spun around. A man in a wrinkled suit, his face flushed with alcohol, was grinning at her. He leaned in too close, his breath smelling of gin. "You look lost," the man slurred. "Why don't you come have a drink with me? I got a booth." "Let go of me," Elena said, trying to pull her arm free. "Oh, come on, don't be like that," the man laughed, tightening his grip. "Just one drink. You look like you need to loosen up." Elena opened her mouth to scream, but before she could, the man suddenly let go. He didn't just let go, he recoiled, stumbling back as if he had been shoved. Though no one had touched him, Elena looked up. Dominic was there. He had come down from the heavens, or rather, the VIP balcony. He stood beside her, creating a physical barrier between her and the drunk. He wore a black dress shirt, the top buttons undone, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms corded with muscle. The look on his face was terrifying. It was pure. Concentrated violence directed entirely at the businessman. "Get out," Dominic said. The businessman blinked, trying to focus. "Do you know who I am? I spend $10,000 a month in this." "I don't care if you spend $1 million, Dominic said, his voice low enough that only they could hear it over the music. "Touch her again, and you will leave this building through the window." The businessman paled. He mumbled an apology and vanished into the crowd. Dominic turned to Elena. He didn't look angry at her. He looked tired. One of his hands came up to gently circle her elbow. His touch was light, respectful, but firm. "This is the last place you should be alone," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. He guided her through the crowd, his body shielding hers from the pressing bodies. He led her to a private elevator in the back. Keying in a code, they rode up in silence. When the doors opened, the noise of the club vanished, replaced by the hush of a soundproofed office. It was a massive room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. A mahogany desk dominated the space, covered in files. Dominic walked to a side table and poured a glass of water. He handed it to her. Elena ignored the water. "Why did you lie to me?" she demanded. Dominic sighed, running a hand through his hair. He looked exhausted. "I haven't lied to you. Elena, not once. You said you tried to help Ryan. She accused, but you run the syndicate. You are the king. Nothing happens in this city without your permission. If you wanted him saved, he would be saved." "It doesn't work like that," Dominic said, his voice sharp. He turned to face her, leaning back against the desk. "I am not a god. I inherited a mess. I inherited a war. I tried to get Ryan out because—" He stopped. "Because what?" Elena stepped closer, fueled by the adrenaline of the night. "Because you felt guilty? Because you knew his sister? Because he was a kid!" Dominic shouted back, the sudden volume making her flinch. "Because I was tired of watching kids die for a bottom line I never asked for." The silence that followed was ringing. Elena stared at him. She saw the chest heaving beneath his shirt. She saw the raw frustration in his eyes. "Then tell me who killed him," she whispered. "If it wasn't you, tell me who it was. Give me a name." "I can't," Dominic said, his voice dropping to a rasp. "Why? Because if I give you a name, you will go after them. And they will kill you." "I don't care. I do." Dominic moved then. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Elena turned to leave, furious, but he caught her wrist. It wasn't a hard grip, it was soft, desperate. He pulled her back. Spinning her around, momentum carried her forward. She collided with his chest. For a second, neither of them moved. Elena looked up. Dominic was looking down at her, his eyes dark and searching. His hand was still wrapped around her wrist, his thumb resting on her pulse point. She could feel the heat of his body radiating through his shirt. She could see the rise and fall of his chest. The anger was still there, but something else was rising to meet it. A tension that had nothing to do with hatred. It was thick and electric, crackling in the air between them. Dominic's gaze dropped to her lips, then back up to her eyes. His head lowered. Just an inch. An almost kiss hung in the space between them. A question waiting to be asked. Elena's breath hitched. She felt her body leaning in, betraying her mind. Then the memory of Ryan's face flashed in her mind. She yanked her wrist free, stumbling back. "Don't," she gasped. Dominic froze. He straightened up, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He looked like he had been slapped. Elena turned and stormed out of the office, slamming the heavy door behind her. She marched to the elevator, pressing the button repeatedly. Her heart was racing faster than it had when the intruder broke in. She was shaking. She wasn't just afraid of him. She was afraid of the way her body had answered him. She was afraid that in the center of the monster's lair, she had wanted to stay. 3 days later, the envelope appeared in Elena's mailbox. It was plain white, unmarked, with no return address and no stamp. Inside, there was no letter, no threat, and no explanation. There was only a small, matte black thumb drive. Elena sat at her kitchen table, the device resting in her palm like a live coal. The apartment was silent, the broken lock on her door now replaced with a heavy-duty deadbolt she had installed herself. Though the sense of violation remained, she hesitated for a long time before plugging the drive into her laptop. A folder popped up on the screen titled simply, Ryan. Her breath hitched. Her hand hovered over the trackpad, trembling. Part of her wanted to yank the drive out and throw it into the river, to refuse whatever poison Dominic Rinaldi was trying to feed her now. But the desperate need for answers, the same need that had driven her to the police station and the nightclub, forced her to click the file. A video player opened. The footage was grainy, obviously taken from a security camera mounted high in a hallway. The timestamp in the corner read 3 years ago, 2 days before Ryan died. The location was a dingy corridor with peeling wallpaper. Elena recognized her brother instantly. He looked thinner than she remembered, his hoodie pulled up, his body language frantic and jittery. He was pacing, scratching at his arms. Then, a door opened. A man stepped out. Elena leaned closer to the screen, squinting. The man was not one of the polished soldiers she had seen flanking Dominic. He was scruffy, wearing a thick leather jacket with a distinct patch on the back, a coiled green snake with a dagger through it. She knew that symbol. Everyone in the neighborhood knew it. It did not belong to the Rinaldis. It belonged to the Guerra crew, a rival faction known for pushing the cheapest, deadliest synthetics on the market. On the screen, Ryan handed the man a wad of cash. The man handed him a small plastic bag. The video ended. Elena sat back, the silence of the room rushing in to fill the space where her certainty used to be. For 3 years, she had hated Dominic Rinaldi with a purity that burned. She had blamed him for the poison that killed her brother. She had built her entire grief around the idea that he was the architect of her loss. But the man in the video was a Guerra. The Rinaldis and the Guerras were at war. Dominic would never have allowed a Guerra dealer to operate on his territory, let alone supply someone he claimed to be protecting. The confusion made her nauseous. If Dominic hadn't killed Ryan, if he had actually been telling the truth in the alleyway, then everything she thought she knew was wrong. The Emberline looked different in the daylight, without the thumping bass and the crush of bodies. It was just a building, a cold, imposing structure of glass and steel standing watch over the gray waters of the harbor. It was mid-afternoon. The club was technically closed, but the front door was unlocked. Elena pushed inside, clutching her bag against her side. The main floor was empty, smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and stale champagne. Chairs were overturned on the tables. The only light came from the floor-to-ceiling windows behind the bar, casting long, stark shadows across the polished floor. Dominic was there. He was standing behind the bar, wiping down a glass with a white towel. He didn't look like the untouchable silent king today. He had abandoned the suit jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. The sleeves rolled up to his elbows to reveal forearms that were thick with muscle and marked by faint, pale scars. His tie hung loose around his neck. He looked tired. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper in the natural light, etching a map of exhaustion into his features. He didn't look up when she approached. "You watched it," he stated. It wasn't a question. Elena stopped at the bar, placing her bag on a stool. "Why?" she asked, her voice echoing in the cavernous room. "Why send it now?" Dominic set the glass down. He looked at her then, his gray eyes guarded. "Because you were going to get yourself killed chasing a ghost. You needed to see that the ghost wasn't me." Elena pulled the thumb drive from her pocket and set it on the mahogany counter. It clicked softly against the wood. It was a Guerra dealer. She said, "Yes." Dominic replied. The Guerras were trying to move in on the East End back then. They were pushing a new mix. It was cheap, potent, and unstable. We were trying to clear them out, but they found the cracks. They found the people who were desperate enough not to care about the brand name. Like Ryan, Elena whispered. Dominic flinched. It was a subtle movement, a tightening of his jaw, but she saw it. I tried. Elena, he said, his voice rough. I knew he was spiraling. I set up a bed for him at a private facility in Vermont, fully paid, no paper trail. I had a car ready to take him. Elena felt tears pricking her eyes, hot and sudden. He never told me. He was ashamed, Dominic said softly. He wanted to get clean before he faced you. He told me he was going to take the ride, but the night before the car was supposed to pick him up. He disappeared. My men tore the city apart looking for him. By the time we found him, he stopped. He didn't need to finish. Elena knew how they found him. Dominic picked up the rag again, gripping it tightly. I burned that dealer's operation to the ground 3 days later, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. Every single person who touched that bag paid for it, but it didn't bring the kid back. Elena stared at him. She watched the way his knuckles turned white against the bar. She saw the genuine pain in his eyes, not the performance of a guilty man trying to save face, but the haunting of a man who had lost something he tried to save. Her anger, which had been a solid, immovable rock for 3 years, began to crack. It shifted into something heavier, more complicated. It became grief. So you are a hero then, she asked, her voice trembling. Is that what you want me to say? You tried to save him, so I should forgive you for running the empire that created the market in the first place? Dominic's head snapped up. I never asked for your forgiveness. You profit from it, Elena shouted, the sound startling in the empty room. You stand there in your expensive shirt, inside your $1 million club, and you act like you are different from the Guerras, but you are the same. You sell the same poison. You ruin the same lives. The only difference is that you wear a better suit while you do it. Dominic slammed his hand onto the bar. The sound was like a gunshot. Do you think I chose this? He roared back. He walked around the bar, closing the distance between them. He didn't touch her, but his presence was overwhelming. He radiated heat and fury. I was born into this. Elena, my father built this. My uncle built this. When my father died, I had 2 choices. I could let Marco take over, a man who would burn this entire city down just to watch the sparks. Or I could take the seat. I could take the crown and try to steer the ship away from the iceberg. He gripped the edge of the bar next to her, leaning in, his veins standing out against the tanned skin of his neck. I have spent 10 years trying to legitimize this family, he said, his voice shaking with intensity. I cut the human trafficking. I cut the weapons deals. I am moving money into construction, into real estate, into places where people don't die. But you cannot turn an ocean liner on a dime. Elena, if I stop everything tomorrow, the Guerras take over. The vacuum fills with people 10 times worse than me. And then more kids like Ryan die. Elena stared at him, her chest heaving. She saw the trap he was in. She saw the cage he had built for himself out of duty and blood. It is not enough, she whispered. It is not enough to be the lesser of 2 evils. I know, Dominic rasped. He looked away, staring out the window at the gray sky. God, do you think I don't know that? The air between them was thick with unsaid words. Elena couldn't breathe in the club anymore. The scent of him, the intensity of his eyes, the confusion in her own heart. It was too much. She turned and ran. Elena, Dominic called after her. She pushed through the heavy doors and burst out into the alleyway behind the club. The weather had turned. The gray sky had opened up, unleashing a torrent of icy rain that soaked her instantly. She didn't stop. She marched down the alley, water plastering her hair to her face, mixing with the tears she finally let fall. She heard the heavy door slam open behind her. Footsteps splashed on the wet pavement. Elena, wait. She spun around. Dominic was there. He had followed her out into the storm, ignoring the rain that instantly soaked his white shirt, making it cling to his chest. Go back inside, she screamed over the sound of the downpour. Leave me alone, I can't, Dominic shouted back. He caught up to her near his parked car, a sleek black sedan gleaming under the rain. "You think you can just drop a bomb like that and walk away? You think I don't carry Ryan's death with me every single day? I don't care about your guilt," Elena cried, wiping water from her eyes. "I care that I am terrified all the time. I am terrified of the Guerras. I am terrified of the police. And I am terrified of you." Dominic stopped. He stood in the rain, water streaming down his face, dripping from his jaw. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said, his voice dropping, though it carried clearly through the storm. "I would burn the world before I let anything happen to you." "Why?" Elena demanded, stepping closer, her anger dissolving into desperation. "Why me? Why do you care? You are the king of Harborview." "I am nobody. You are the only thing in this city that is real," Dominic said. The words hung in the air, suspended between the falling droplets. "I watched you for 3 years," Dominic said, his voice raw. "I watched you fight for your brother. I watched you work double shifts to pay for his headstone. I watched you fight for those kids at the center. In a world full of people who only take, you are the only one I have ever seen who gives." He took a step closer. The space between them vanished. "I look at you, and I remember that there is something worth saving," he whispered. Elena looked up at him. She was shivering, but not from the cold. She was tired. She was so incredibly tired of fighting him, of fighting the city, of fighting the pull she felt in her chest every time he looked at her. "I am tired, Dominic," she said, her voice breaking on a sob. "I am tired of being afraid. I am tired of hating you." Dominic reached out. His hand was wet and warm. He cupped her jaw, his fingers sliding into her soaked hair. He tilted her face up to his. "Then don't," he murmured. He used the pad of his thumb to wipe a tear from her cheek, blending it with the rain. His touch was reverent. It was an anchor in the storm. Elena looked at his mouth. She looked at the scar on his lip. She looked at the man who had waited in the shadows for 3 years just to make sure she got home safe. She didn't think. She just felt. Elena leaned in first. She rose on her tiptoes and pressed her mouth to his. For a second, Dominic went still, as if he couldn't believe it was happening. Then, a low sound broke from his throat, something between a groan and a prayer. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him. The kiss was not gentle. It was desperate. It was the taste of rain and salt and 3 years of silence finally being broken. It was a collision of grief and need. Elena's hands grabbed the front of his soaked shirt, twisting the fabric in her fists, anchoring herself to him. Dominic's hand slid from her jaw to the back of her neck, his fingers threading into her hair, holding her steady as he deepened the kiss. His mouth moved against hers with a hunger that shook her to her core. He tasted like coffee and storm, his body pressed against hers. Hard and solid, a shield against the world. There was no hesitation now, no questions. There was only the heat of his skin through the wet clothes and the frantic beating of her own heart. They pulled apart, gasping for air, their foreheads resting against each other. Rainwater dripped from his nose onto hers. "Elena," Dominic breathed, his voice wrecked. Elena opened her eyes. She felt dizzy, electrified. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask him what this meant, to ask him what they were doing. Screech. The sound of tires locking on asphalt tore through the moment. A black SUV skidded around the corner of the alley, blocking the exit. The doors flew open before the vehicle even came to a full stop. 4 men jumped out. They were wearing ski masks and tactical vests. They held automatic rifles. Dominic's reaction was instantaneous. The lever vanished. The soldier took over. He shoved Elena behind him, his body becoming a human wall. "Get down," he shouted. "Cleaning up Guerra's mess," one of the masked men screamed. "The boss wants the girl." Gunfire erupted. It was deafening in the narrow alley. Bullets sparked against the brick wall inches from Elena's head. She screamed, covering her ears, dropping to the wet pavement. Dominic didn't have a gun. He had left it inside. "Move," Dominic yelled. He grabbed Elena by the jacket and hauled her up, practically throwing her toward the heavy metal dumpster against the wall. Another SUV roared into the other end of the alley. Headlights blinded them. Elena thought it was over. She thought they were trapped. Then she saw Nate leaning out of the window of the second car, a pistol in his hand. Dominic's men. "Get them!" Nate shouted. The alley turned into a war zone. Dominic's security team poured out of the second vehicle, returning fire. The sound was a chaotic symphony of cracks and thuds. Dominic didn't join the fight. His only focus was Elena. He tackled her, driving her into the small wedge of space between the dumpster and the wall. He covered her body with his own, pressing her into the wet concrete. She could feel his heart hammering against her back, fast but steady. "Stay down," he commanded, his mouth right at her ear. "Don't move." Bullets slammed into the metal of the dumpster. Ringing like bells, glass shattered somewhere above them. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, gripping Dominic's arm. She could smell the cordite smoke mixing with the rain. Then, as quickly as it started, the shooting stopped. "Clear!" Nate's voice rang out. "They are running!" Tires screeched again as the first SUV peeled away. Speeding backwards out of the alley, Dominic stayed on top of her for another 10 seconds, waiting. Only when the silence returned did he shift. "Are you hit?" he demanded, grabbing her shoulders and checking her over with frantic hands. "Elena, look at me." "Are you hit?" No," she stammered, shaking violently. "I am okay." Dominic let out a breath that sounded like a curse. He stood up, pulling her with him. Nate walked over, holstering his weapon. He looked grim. "We clipped one of them. He's down over there." Dominic's face changed, the warmth that had been there during the kiss, the panic that had been there during the ambush. It was all gone. His face became a mask of ice. "Keep her here," Dominic said to Nate. He walked over to where a man was groaning on the ground, clutching a bleeding leg. The attacker had lost his mask in the fall. He was young, terrified, and trying to crawl away. Dominic stepped on the man's wounded leg. He didn't stomp. He just applied pressure. The man screamed. "Who sent you?" Dominic asked. His voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of the monster Elena had always feared. The man sobbed. "I don't know, just a job." Dominic increased the pressure. "I am going to ask you one time," Dominic said. "If you lie to me, you will never walk again. Who sent you? The Guerras? No?" The man shrieked. "No, it wasn't the Guerras. Then who? It was Marco." The man screamed. "It was Marco. He said you were weak. He said the girl was the loose end." Elena gasped. She covered her mouth with her hand. "Marco." Dominic went completely still. The rain plastered his hair to his skull. He stared down at the man, his face draining of color. Marco Rinaldi, his uncle. The man who had raised him after his father died, the man Dominic had protected, the man he had called family. Dominic stepped back, lifting his foot. He looked like he had been punched in the gut. "Get him out of here," Dominic said to Nate. His voice was hollow. "Find out everything he knows." Nate nodded, signaling 2 other men to drag the wounded attacker away. Dominic turned slowly to face Elena. He looked devastated. In the harsh light of the street lamps, with the rain washing the blood from the pavement, he looked like a man who had just realized he was standing in the middle of a burning house. Elena walked toward him. She ignored the fear. She reached out and took his hand. It was ice cold. "Dominic?" she whispered. He looked at her, and the fear in his eyes was naked. "It is inside," he said, his voice barely audible. "The war isn't with the Guerras. Elena, it is inside the house." He squeezed her hand so hard it hurt. "Marco ordered the hit. He said he tried to kill you to get to me." Elena realized then that the danger hadn't passed. It had just changed shape. Dominic wasn't the monster under her bed. He was the only thing standing between her and the wolves were his own blood. "We have to go," Dominic said, pulling her toward his car. "Now." "Where?" Elena asked, stumbling to keep up with him. "Somewhere he can't find us," Dominic said, opening the door for her. As Elena slid into the leather seat, she looked back at the alley. She saw the blood washing into the drain. She saw the empty space where they had kissed just moments ago. She wasn't afraid of Dominic anymore, but as the engine roared to life, she realized she was terrified for him. The safe house was nothing like the glass and steel fortress of the Ember Line, nor did it resemble the upscale penthouse Elena assumed a man like Dominic Rinaldi would call home. It was a small, second-story apartment situated directly above a dusty, shuttered bookstore in a neighborhood so quiet it felt forgotten by the rest of Harborview. The floors were warped hardwood that groaned underfoot, and the air smelled permanently of old paper and lemon polish. Dominic had insisted on this location for one reason. It was off the books. No one in the organization knew about it except for Nate. It was a ghost property, paid for in cash under a fake name a decade ago. For the first 48 hours, Elena paced the length of the living room like a caged animal. She resented the stillness. She resented the way Dominic checked the window blinds every hour. Most of all, she resented the fact that every time the floorboards creaked in the hallway, her heart slammed against her ribs in terror, making her reluctantly admit that the heavy steel deadbolt Dominic had installed was the only thing keeping her sanity intact. By the third evening, the silence in the apartment had shifted from stifling to something intimately domestic. In the cramped kitchen, which was barely wide enough for two people to stand abreast, Dominic was trying to cook. It was a surreal sight. The king of Harborview, a man who commanded armies and negotiated million-dollar deals, was currently staring at a frying pan with an expression of profound defeat. "Damn it," Dominic muttered, scraping a spatula against the non-stick surface. Elena, who'd been sitting at the small circular table nursing a mug of tea, stood up and leaned against the doorframe. Smoke was rising from the pan. "You are burning them," she pointed out, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth despite the tension that had defined their last few days. "I am aware," Dominic grumbled, tossing the spatula onto the counter. "The burner on this stove has two settings, off and incinerate." Elena laughed. It was a rusty sound, surprised out of her, but it seemed to lighten the air in the room instantly. Dominic looked over his shoulder at the sound, his eyes softening. He looked less like a mob boss and more like a frustrated man trying to impress a woman, wearing a plain gray t-shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders and sweatpants that hung low on his hips. "Move over," Elena said, stepping into the kitchenette. "You are useless." She nudged him aside with her hip. It was a casual, instinctive contact, but in the small space, it felt electric. Dominic didn't move away. He stayed right there, his arm brushing against hers as she took the handle of the pan and lifted it off the heat. He watched her work. He watched her scrape the charred eggs into the bin and crack two fresh ones into the pan with practiced ease. The kitchen was so small that every time she turned to grab the salt or the pepper, her shoulder bumped against his chest. He didn't step back to give her room. Instead, he seemed to lean into the contact, a solid, warm presence at her back. When they finally sat down to eat, the eggs were perfect, but the atmosphere had changed. The easy banter died down, replaced by the heavy reality of why they were hiding. They sat across from each other at the small wooden table, their knees almost touching underneath it. Elena traced the rim of her coffee mug, watching the steam curl into the air. "Tell me about him," Elena said quietly. "Marco." Dominic stopped mid-sip. He set his mug down slowly. His face, which had been open and relaxed just moments ago, shuddered. The lines of exhaustion around his eyes seemed to deepen. "He's my father's younger brother," Dominic said, his voice devoid of emotion. "When my father was killed, I was 22. I was just a kid who thought he knew how the world worked." Marco stepped in. He took the chair. "He kept the wolves at bay until I was ready. He taught you." Elena said, "He taught me everything," Dominic corrected. "He taught me how to read a ledger, how to spot a lie, how to negotiate from a position of weakness and make it look like strength. He taught me that mercy is expensive, but necessary if you want loyalty." Dominic looked down at his hands. They were large, capable hands, currently clenched into fists on the tabletop. "He was the one who bought me my first suit." Dominic continued, his voice thickening with a mix of disbelief and grief. "He sat with me in the hospital waiting room when my mother got sick. He was my father, in every way that mattered, and now he wants you dead," Elena whispered. Dominic looked up. His eyes were bleak. He doesn't just want me dead. Elena, he wants to erase me. He thinks I have gone soft. He thinks my attempts to legitimize the business are a weakness. He wants to take the family back to the old days. Drugs, trafficking, blood on the streets. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. That is why he went after you, Dominic said intensely. He knows you are the proof that I want something else. You are the symbol of everything he hates. Elena looked at his hand covering hers. She realized then that the war wasn't just about territory. It was about the soul of the man sitting in front of her. Marco wanted to turn Dominic back into a monster. Elena was the anchor keeping him human. 2 days later, the walls started closing in. Dominic had been gone for hours, meeting Nate in a secure location to gather intel. Elena was alone in the apartment with nothing but old paperbacks and her own spiraling thoughts. She felt trapped. She felt like a piece of luggage that had been stored away until it was safe to retrieve. Her phone buzzed. It was a notification from social media. It was her coworker, Sarah's birthday. Sarah, who worked the morning shift at the coffee shop and always snuck Elena extra pastries. Elena looked at the photo Sarah had posted, a blurry selfie at the Rusty Anchor, a dive bar 3 blocks away. I just need to see people, Elena told herself. I just need to feel normal for 1 hour. It was a reckless thought. Born of anxiety and cabin fever, she knew it was stupid. But the need to step outside, to breathe air that didn't smell of old paper, to hear laughter that wasn't edged with fear, was overwhelming. She put on her coat. She checked the peephole. The street was empty. Dominic won't even know, she reasoned. I will be back before he returns. She slipped out the back door, down the fire escape, and into the cool night air. The Rusty Anchor was loud, crowded, and smelled of stale beer and fried food. It was perfect. Elena found Sarah in a booth near the back, surrounded by friends, for 45 minutes. Elena pretended her life wasn't falling apart. She laughed at bad jokes. She drank a cheap soda. She let herself forget about Marco and hitmen and the thumb drive in her pocket. Then the door to the bar slammed open. The sound was aggressive enough to cut through the jukebox music. Heads turned. Dominic Rinaldi stood in the doorway. He looked terrifying. He was wearing a dark leather jacket, his face a mask of thunderous fury. His eyes scanned the room with predatory efficiency, bypassing the drunk patrons and locking instantly onto Elena. Elena's stomach dropped. She stood up, murmuring a quick excuse to Sarah, and hurried toward the exit. Dominic didn't wait for her. He turned on his heel and marched out into the parking lot. Elena followed him out. The air was cold, damp with the threat of rain. The parking lot was illuminated by a single, flickering streetlight that buzzed angrily overhead. Are you insane? Dominic turned on her the moment the door swung shut behind them. His voice was a low growl, vibrating with suppressed rage. I just wanted to see my friends. Elena defended herself, crossing her arms against the chill. I was going crazy in that apartment. Dominic, I couldn't breathe. You could have died, Dominic shouted. Stepping closer, he gestured wildly at the street. Marco has eyes everywhere. Do you think he stopped looking for you? Do you think this is a game? I am not a prisoner, Elena yelled back, her own anger flaring to match his. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask to be part of your war. I just wanted a normal night. There is no normal anymore, Dominic snapped. He closed the distance between them, towering over her. Not until this is over. I tracked your phone and my heart stopped. Elena, for 10 minutes. I thought they had you. I thought I had lost you. The raw panic in his voice stopped her cold. She looked up at him. His chest was heaving. His hands were shaking slightly where they hung at his sides. He wasn't just angry. He was terrified. You have to take this seriously, he said, his voice dropping to a desperate rasp. It is not about control. It is about your life. And I cannot survive losing you. The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. Elena looked at his mouth. She looked at the fire in his gray eyes. The fear and the anger swirling inside her collided with something else, something hot and frantic that had been building since the night in the alley. She didn't back down. She stepped forward. Then stop yelling at me and protect me, she challenged, her voice shaking. Dominic stared at her. The fury in his eyes darkened into something scorching. He stepped in. He moved so fast she didn't have time to gasp. He backed her up until her spine hit the cold metal of his car door. He boxed her in, his arms bracing on the roof of the car on either side of her head, caging her body with his. He didn't touch her. He left her enough space to push him away, to run, to scream. She didn't run. Dominic's breath brushed her temple, hot and ragged. "Tell me to stop," he warned, his voice a rough whisper against her skin. "Tell me to stop, and I will walk away." Elena reached up. She grabbed the lapels of his leather jacket and yanked him down. "Don't you dare stop," she breathed. Dominic crashed his mouth down on hers. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was an explosion of pent-up fear and adrenaline and months of denied longing. He kissed her hard, devouring the sound she made in her throat. Elena opened to him instantly. Her hands slid up his chest, wrapping around his neck, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. She pulled him closer, needing to feel the weight of him, the reality of him. Dominic groaned, a low, guttural sound that vibrated against her lips. One of his hands left the roof of the car and splayed wide over her lower back, pressing her flush against his hips. The heat of his body was overwhelming even through their layers of clothing. His tongue swept into her mouth, tasting her, claiming her. It was a slow, hungry rhythm that made her knees weak. Elena arched into him, her body betraying every instinct of self-preservation she had left. It felt wrong. He was the king of Harborview, the man she should hate. But it felt right. He was the only person in the world who made her feel safe. Dominic's other hand moved to her waist, gripping her tightly, anchoring her as the kiss deepened. He tilted his head, changing the angle, drinking her in as if she were the only air left in the city. They stood there under the flickering streetlight, wrapped in each other, oblivious to the danger and the cold. For a minute, there was no war. There was no Marco. There was only the friction of their bodies and the desperate, frantic heat of their mouths moving together. Dominic broke the kiss first. He pulled back just an inch, his forehead resting against hers. His breathing was ragged, his eyes were squeezed shut, his lashes dark against his flushed skin. "God." "Elena," he whispered, his voice wrecked. Elena opened her eyes. She was trembling. Her lips felt swollen, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She stared at him, shaken by the intensity of what had just happened. "We have to go back," Dominic rasped. Though he didn't move away, he stayed close, his body shielding her from the night. "We are exposed here." Elena nodded, unable to find her voice. She realized then that she was in trouble. Deep, terrible trouble. She wasn't just falling for him, she had already fallen. The drive back to the safe house was silent, the air inside the car thick with unsaid words. When they arrived, Nate was waiting for them by the back entrance. He looked grim. He held a thick manila envelope in his hand. "We need to talk," Nate said, glancing between Dominic and Elena. Inside, they went up to the apartment. Dominic locked the door, the heavy click of the deadbolt echoing in the quiet room. He took off his jacket, his movements stiff, and turned to Nate. "What do you have?" Dominic asked. Nate tossed the envelope onto the kitchen table. It slid across the wood and stopped in front of Elena. "We hacked Marco's financials," Nate said. "We found a recurring payment to a shell company. We traced the company back to a ghost account. It belongs to a cop." Dominic's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Nate looked at Elena, his expression apologetic. "Detective Ethan Cole." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. She reached out and opened the envelope with numb fingers. Inside were bank statements and printed emails. Subject: the ward girl. Body. "She's asking questions again. I tried to warn her off at the station, but she is persistent. Do you want me to bring her in on a trumped-up charge to keep her on ice?" Elena stared at the words. The letters swam before her eyes. Ethan, her ex-boyfriend, the man who had looked her in the eye in the precinct hallway and promised to help her. The man who had told her to go home and lock her door. "He wasn't trying to protect me," Elena whispered, her voice hollow. "He was keeping tabs on me for Marco." She felt a wave of nausea. The betrayal cut deeper than she expected. Ethan had been part of her life before. He was supposed to be one of the good guys. Dominic walked around the table. He saw the look on her face, the devastation, the sudden feeling of being completely alone in the world. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't ask for details. He pulled a chair out and sat next to her. He took her hand, the one that was trembling on top of the damning papers. His hand was large and warm, swallowing hers completely. He reached her, Dominic said quietly, his thumb stroking slow, soothing circles on the back of her hand. "But he won't touch you. I promise you. Elena, Ethan Cole will never come near you again." Elena looked at their joined hands. Dominic's touch was the only steady thing in a world that was rapidly crumbling under her feet. She leaned into him, just slightly, her shoulder brushing his arm. Before she could answer, Dominic's phone buzzed. It was a harsh, jarring sound. He pulled it out. He read the text message, and the softness vanished from his face instantly. His expression turned into stone. "What is it?" Elena asked, fear spiking in her chest. Dominic stood up. He walked to the window, staring out at the dark street. "They hit the warehouse in the South District," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. "My men. 4 of them are dead," Nate swore softly. "They left a message." Dominic continued, "Painted on the wall in red. Step aside. Nephew." The room went silent. Elena looked at Dominic's back. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man preparing for a firing squad. "This isn't business anymore," Dominic said, turning around. He looked at Elena, his eyes burning with a terrifying resolve. "Marco knows I won't strike first because he is family. He's banking on my guilt. He's banking on me being the boy he raised." He walked back to the table. He placed his hands flat on the wood and leaned down, looking directly at Elena. "He's wrong," Dominic said. "I'm not going to run anymore. Elena," he told her, "I am not going to hide you in attics and basements while he picks my life apart. I am going to end this." Elena stood up. She faced him. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "I am going to take the offensive," Dominic said. "I am going to burn his network down, piece by piece, and when I am done, when he has nothing left, I am going to make sure you never have to look over your shoulder again." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His touch was gentle, but his eyes were full of war. "I want you to have a life," he whispered. "A real life. One that doesn't involve locks and guards and fear." Elena looked at him. She thought about the apartment above the bookstore. She thought about the burned eggs. She thought about the kiss in the parking lot, the way his body felt against hers, the way he looked at her as if she were the only thing that mattered. She realized then that a normal life, a life without him, was no longer something she wanted. It would be empty, it would be safe, and it would be cold. "I don't want a life that doesn't include you," Elena said. The admission hung in the air. Dominic went still. He looked at her with a mixture of shock and raw hope. "Elena," he started. "Don't promise me a future where you are not there," she said fiercely. "If we are going to fight him, we fight him, but we do it so we can be together, not so you can send me away." Dominic stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, a slow, solemn nod. "Okay," he said. "Together." He turned to Nate. "Get the car," Dominic ordered. "We are moving. We are going to the cabin, and then we are going to war." The cabin sat at the end of a long, winding dirt road that disappeared into the dense pine forests 2 hours north of Harborview. It was a Rinaldi family property, bought decades ago under a shell corporation that not even Marco knew the details of, or so Dominic hoped. The structure was rough-hewn timber and stone, overlooking a lake that looked like a sheet of black glass under the moonlight. Inside, the air smelled of cedar, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of gun oil. Dominic had moved Elena here immediately after the ambush in the alley. For 2 days, they had existed in a state of high-alert purgatory. The silence of the woods was unnerving compared to the constant thrum of the city. Every creak of the settling floorboards sounded like a footstep. Every rustle of wind in the pines sounded like a whispered threat. The cabin was small, forcing an intimacy that neither of them knew how to navigate. They moved around each other in the kitchenette and the main living area, a constant dance of avoidance and magnetic pull. Dominic spent most of his time on the radio with Nate, who was holding down the fort in the city, or cleaning his weapons with a methodical, terrifying focus. Elena spent her time watching him, the image of him shielding her body with his own in the alleyway replaying on a loop in her mind. On the third evening, the atmosphere shifted from tense to suffocating. Dominic had been on a secure line with Nate for over an hour. Elena watched from the kitchen as Dominic's posture, usually rigid and commanding, began to slump. He ran a hand down his face, gripping his jaw as if trying to physically hold himself together. He ended the call without a goodbye, tossing the burner phone onto the couch cushions before walking out onto the porch. Elena hesitated. She looked at the closed door, then at the darkness outside. She knew she should give him space. She knew he was a man at war, but the silence stretching between them felt more dangerous than anything waiting in the woods. She opened the door and stepped out. The night air was crisp, biting at her skin through her sweater. Dominic was standing at the railing, leaning heavily on his hands, staring out at the black water of the lake. His shoulders were tight, the muscles in his back visible even through his dark Henley shirt. "Bad news?" Elena asked softly. Dominic didn't turn around. "We lost the unions," he said, his voice sounding like gravel grinding together. Marco flipped the port stewards. "They are refusing to offload any cargo that doesn't come with his seal. And 3 of my capos, men I have known since I was a boy, men who ate at my mother's table, just pledged loyalty to him." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "It is a domino effect, Elena. Once they smell blood in the water, the sharks don't care who fed them yesterday. They just eat." Elena stepped closer. She could feel the heat radiating off him, a mix of anger and a deep, crushing exhaustion. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his bicep. The muscle was rock hard, tense with the urge to hit something. She didn't pull away. Instead, she slid her hand down the length of his arm until her fingers found his hand. She entwined her fingers with his, squeezing tight. Dominic went still. He looked down at their joined hands, then slowly turned his head to look at her. His eyes were dark pools of turmoil. "I wanted out," he confessed. The admission came out in a rush, as if he had been holding it back for years. "I have been moving money for 5 years. Clean money. I bought a construction firm, a logistics company. I had a plan to slowly transition the family assets into legitimate holdings. I wanted to be a CEO, not a king. I wanted to walk into a room and not have people fear for their lives." He turned fully toward her, his free hand coming up to run through his hair. "Then I met you," he said, his voice dropping to a hushed intensity. "I watched you fight for those kids in the system. I watched you take on a broken bureaucracy with nothing but grit and compassion. You made me believe that redemption was possible, that maybe, just maybe, I deserved something better than the blood I was born into." Elena felt her heart stutter. She looked at this man, this feared crime lord, and saw the boy he must have been, the one who had been forced to pick up a gun before he was old enough to vote. "You are not him," Elena said, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. "You are not Marco." "I am a Rinaldi," Dominic countered, his gaze searching hers. "I have done terrible things. Elena, things you can't even imagine." "I know," she whispered. "I know who you are. But the man who holds me when I wake up screaming from nightmares, the man who stood in an alleyway and told me to breathe, that is not a monster. Dominic, that is a man who is trying to survive." She took a step closer, eliminating the space between them. "I am terrified," she admitted, looking up into his face. "I am terrified of this life. I am terrified of what loving you might cost me." Dominic's breath hitched. Loving him. She had said it, but he prompted, his voice barely audible. "But I am more terrified of watching you die alone," she finished, tears pricking her eyes. "I am terrified of a world where I refuse to admit how I feel because I was too scared to take the risk." The wind rustled through the pines, a lonely sound that wrapped around the cabin. Dominic looked at her as if she were a miracle he didn't know how to accept. Slowly, giving her every second to back away, he reached for her. "Let's go inside," he murmured. The living room was lit only by a single table lamp in the corner, casting long, soft shadows across the worn furniture. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, glowing a dull, pulsing red. Dominic stopped in the center of the room. He turned to her. He didn't grab her. He didn't pull her. He simply stood there, his hands open at his sides, an invitation and a surrender. Elena didn't hesitate. She took a step forward. She reached out and placed her hands on his chest, feeling the heavy, rapid thud of his heart beneath his shirt. She slid her hands up, over the hard planes of his chest, to his shoulders. Dominic let out a shuddering breath. He lowered his head and kissed her. It wasn't like the kiss in the parking lot, fueled by adrenaline and anger. This was tender. It was slow. His lips moved against hers with a reverence that made her knees weak. He tasted of the cold night air and something uniquely him. His hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw, tilting her head back to deepen the angle. Elena melted into him. The fear that had been her constant companion for weeks evaporated, replaced by a warmth that spread from her chest to her fingertips. Dominic's hand slid down her back, resting respectfully at the curve of her waist, pulling her flush against him. He held her as if she were made of glass, as if he were afraid his own strength would shatter her. "You are safe," he whispered against her lips. "I have you." Elena didn't want to be safe. She wanted him. She pulled him closer, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck. She kissed him back with a fierceness that surprised them both, a silent demand that shattered his restraint. They moved together toward the worn leather couch. Dominic sat down heavily, pulling her with him. Elena followed, straddling his lap, her knees bracketing his hips on the soft leather cushions. Dominic groaned, his hands gripping her waist to steady her. The shift in position changed everything. The tenderness flared into heat. Their breathing became uneven, ragged gasps in the quiet room. Elena leaned down, kissing the line of his jaw, the sensitive spot behind his ear. She felt his hands tightening on her waist, anchoring her. His mouth trailed along her cheek, hot and desperate, before finding her lips again. His hands moved. One slid up her back, under the hem of her sweater, his skin rough and warm against hers. The friction sent a jolt of electricity through her spine. Dominic pulled back suddenly, just an inch. His forehead rested against hers, his eyes squeezed shut, his chest heaving. His fingers were frozen at the hem of her shirt. "Elena," he rasped, his voice rough with desire. "Are you sure? If we do this, there is no going back. I won't be able to let you go." Elena looked at him. She saw the vulnerability in his gray eyes, the raw need he was trying so hard to leash for her sake. "I don't want to go back," she whispered. She leaned in and kissed him, a slow, deliberate seal on her promise. Dominic's restraint snapped. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her down until there was no space left between them. They sank into the cushions, limbs tangled, the world outside the cabin ceasing to exist. There was only the firelight, the sound of their breathing, and the desperate, affirming heat of two people who had finally found their home in the middle of a war. The morning did not break with sunlight. It broke with the crack of a rifle. Elena was asleep, her head resting on Dominic's chest, the blanket tangled around their legs. The sound tore through the peace of the cabin like a physical blow. Crack, smash. The window above the sink shattered, spraying glass across the kitchen floor. Dominic was moving before Elena's eyes were fully open. He rolled off the couch, dragging her with him onto the floor. "Stay down," he roared. A cylindrical object clattered onto the wooden porch outside, followed by a hiss. Thick gray smoke began to curl under the door frame. "Smoke grenades," Dominic shouted, crawling toward his duffel bag near the fireplace. He pulled out a handgun and an assault rifle. "They are flushing us out." Elena scrambled on her hands and knees, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would burst. The peaceful silence of the woods had been replaced by chaos. More shots rang out, splintering the wood of the front door. Dominic tossed her the handgun. "Do you know how to use this?" he yelled over the noise. "Point and shoot," Elena yelled back, her hands shaking as she gripped the cold metal. "Good enough. Get behind the island." Dominic grabbed her arm and hauled her toward the kitchen island. It was a solid block of oak, the only sturdy cover in the open room. He shoved her behind it, positioning himself between her and the door, the rifle shouldered through the shattered window. Elena could see movement in the smoke, shadowy figures advancing through the trees. Dominic's security team, 3 men who had been stationed in the perimeter, were returning fire, but they were pinned down. Suddenly, the front door was kicked in. One of Dominic's men, a young guy named Russo, stumbled backward into the room, clutching his shoulder. Blood was pouring between his fingers. He collapsed near the entryway, his weapon sliding across the floor. "Man down," Dominic shouted, leaning out from cover to fire a burst of rounds at the doorway, forcing the attackers back. Russo was exposed. If they came through the door again, he was dead. Elena didn't think. She looked at Dominic, who was suppressing the entry, then at the heavy oak dresser standing against the wall a few feet away from the door. "Cover me!" Elena screamed. "Elena, no!" Dominic yelled, but she was already moving. She stayed low, crawling across the floorboards as bullets chewed up the wood around her. She reached Russo, grabbing him by his good arm. "Move," she gritted out, dragging him with all her strength toward the corner. She didn't stop there. She grabbed the edge of the heavy dresser. Adrenaline flooded her system, giving her strength she didn't know she possessed. She shoved it. The wood scraped loudly against the floor. She wedged it diagonally against the door frame, creating a barricade that narrowed the fatal funnel of the entryway. "Get back!" Dominic roared, firing another volley. Elena scrambled back to the island, panting, her hands covered in dust and Russo's blood. Dominic looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. "You are crazy." He breathed. "I am learning," she gasped. Outside, the gunfire intensified, then suddenly stopped. The sound of engines roaring to life echoed through the trees. "They are pulling back," one of the men shouted from outside. Dominic didn't lower his weapon. He waited, listening. The sound of tires fading into the distance confirmed it. He stood up slowly, keeping the rifle trained on the door. "Clear the perimeter," he ordered his team. Elena slumped against the kitchen island, the handgun slipping from her fingers. The cabin was ruined. Glass was everywhere. The smell of gunpowder was choking. Dominic walked over to her. He dropped to his knees, pulling her into his arms. He buried his face in her neck, his whole body shaking. "I thought I lost you," he whispered into her hair. "I thought I lost you." Elena held on to him, staring at the shattered window. "Why did they leave?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They had us pinned. They could have burned the place down." Dominic pulled back. His face was hard, the tenderness of the previous night replaced by the cold calculation of the king. He walked to the window and looked out at the burning remains of their getaway car. "Because he doesn't want to kill me in secret," Dominic said, his voice deadly quiet. He turned back to Elena. "Marco wants a show. He wants to drag me out into the street and execute me in front of the whole city. He wants to prove that the Rinaldi name belongs to the ruthless. If he kills me here, I am a martyr. If he breaks me in public, I am a warning." He looked around the destroyed cabin, at the blood on the floor, at the fear in Elena's eyes. "We can't stay here," Dominic said, "and we can't run anymore." He walked over to his duffel bag and began packing with efficient, jerky movements. "What are we doing?" Elena asked, standing up on shaky legs. "I am going back," Dominic said. "Back to the city?" Elena asked, horrified. "That is suicide. That is exactly what he wants." "No," Dominic said, zipping the bag. "I am not going back to fight him on the street. I am going to the federal building." Elena froze. "The feds? I have the drive," Dominic said, tapping his chest pocket. "I have 10 years of ledgers. I have the names of every corrupt cop, every judge on the payroll, and every shell company Marco uses, including the ones implicated in the trafficking rings I tried to shut down. You are going to turn state's evidence, Elena whispered. Dominic, they will put you in prison. For years. It is the only way, Dominic said, walking over to her. If I hand over the evidence, I can negotiate a deal. I can trade my freedom for yours. I can demand witness protection for you as part of the package. No! Elena grabbed his jacket, gripping the leather with both hands. No! I don't want protection if it means you are in a cage. We can find another way. We can leave the country. We would never make it to the airport, Dominic said sadly. Marco has eyes everywhere. This ends today, Elena. He cupped her face in his hands. His thumbs brushed away the tears that were spilling over her lashes. Please don't go, she begged, her voice breaking. Please don't go alone. I have to, he said firmly. It is the only card I have left to play. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. It was a kiss of goodbye. I promised I would keep you safe, Dominic whispered, looking deep into her eyes. Even if it means you have to live in a world where I am not there, he turned to his men. Get her to the safe zone. Do not stop for anything. Dominic! Elena screamed as he walked out the door. He didn't look back. He walked out into the smoke and the ruin of the morning, getting into the only surviving vehicle. He was going to face his uncle. He was going to burn his own empire to the ground to save the woman who had taught him how to be a man. The waiting room at the Harborview Federal Courthouse was a study in sterile intimidation. The walls were painted a suffocating shade of beige. The chairs were bolted to the floor, and the air smelled of floor wax and stale anxiety. Elena Ward sat in the corner, her back pressed against the cold drywall. Her fingers twisted the worn leather of Ryan's bracelet around her wrist, a nervous tick that had become constant over the last 5 days. 5 days. That was how long it had been since Dominic Rinaldi walked out of the burning cabin and drove into the smoke. Since then, there had been silence. The federal agents who had picked her up at the rendezvous point had been professional but tight-lipped. They told her that Dominic was a person of interest, that there was an active manhunt, but they would not confirm if he was alive or dead. You are safe here. Miss Ward, the lead agent, a man named Reynolds, had told her. We have a full detail on the building. You just need to give your statement to the grand jury, and then we will discuss witness protection relocation. Elena looked at the door. It didn't close all the way. The latch was misaligned, leaving a 1/4-inch gap that let in the murmur of the hallway. Dominic had taught her to look for the cracks. In the weeks she had spent in his orbit, he had rewired her brain. He taught her to check exits. He taught her that security was an illusion created by people who had never been hunted. She looked at the ceiling vent. It was screwed tight. She looked at the windows, bulletproof glass, but the view looked out onto a blind alley where a sniper could easily set up if they knew the schedule. She wasn't paranoid. She was educated. We are ready for you, Reynolds said, opening the door. 2 marshals will escort you to the rear entrance to avoid the press out front. Elena stood up. Her legs felt heavy. She walked into the hallway, flanked by 2 large men in windbreakers with U.S. Marshal printed on the back in yellow block letters. They moved with a heavy, aggressive gait that didn't match the disciplined precision of the agents she had met earlier. They led her toward the elevators, but instead of going up to the courtroom, the man on her left pressed the button for the sub-basement, maintenance access. The man grunted when he saw Elena's look. Safer route. The doors slid shut, sealing them in a metal box. As the elevator descended, Elena stared at the reflection in the brushed steel doors. She looked at the man standing to her right. He was adjusting his cuffs. As his sleeve rode up, she saw ink on the inside of his wrist. It was faint, old and partially faded, but she recognized the shape. It was a dagger wrapped in a vine. Nate had shown her a photo of that symbol weeks ago. It wasn't a federal insignia. It was a prison tat specific to the crew that ran enforcement for Marco Rinaldi in the 90s. Elena's blood turned to ice. These weren't marshals. 3 levels below, in the damp, echoing concrete cavern of the parking garage, Dominic Rinaldi leaned against a pillar. He was invisible in the shadows. He wore a nondescript navy maintenance jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Under the jacket, his shirt was taped tightly against his side, but the blood was already seeping through the gauze, sticky and hot. The bullet from the cabin fight had grazed his ribs, and the infection was setting in, making his skin burn with fever. He ignored the pain. He had been ignoring it for 5 days. He raised his binoculars, scanning the entrance to the service elevators. He saw the doors open. He saw Elena. She looked pale, terrified, and small between the 2 men flanking her. Dominic focused the lenses on the man to her right. He saw the way the man held his weapon, loose, unprofessional. He saw the tattoo. "Got you," Dominic whispered, his voice a raw scrape against his throat. He touched the earpiece hidden in his ear. "Nate, they are moving her to the sub-basement corridor. It is a trap." Nate's voice came back, crackling with static. "I am 10 seconds out. I will block the east exit. Do not engage unless you have to. Dom, you are in no condition to fight. I am not letting them take her," Dominic replied. He dropped the binoculars and moved. He didn't run. Running drew attention. He moved with a swift, silent purpose, slipping through the rows of parked cars like smoke. He reached the stairwell door and slipped inside, taking the concrete steps 2 at a time, the pain in his side flaring white-hot with every impact. The elevator doors opened onto a long, dim utility corridor. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping condensation onto the gray concrete floor. The lights overhead flickered with a nauseating buzz. "Keep moving," the fake marshal growled, shoving Elena forward. She stumbled, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew what was happening. They weren't taking her to testify. They were taking her to a secondary location to finish what Marco had started at the cabin. She looked for a weapon, a fire extinguisher, a loose pipe, anything. "There is a car waiting at the loading dock," the other man said into a radio. "We have the package." Elena stopped. "Move!" the man barked, grabbing her arm. "No," Elena said. The man sneered. He pulled a gun from his waistband, not a service weapon, but a snub-nosed revolver. "I said move, bitch, or I will drag you." The metal service door at the far end of the hallway slammed open. The sound echoed like a thunderclap. Both men spun around, raising their weapons. A figure stepped out of the darkness. Dominic looked like a wraith. His face was pale, covered in days of stubble. His jacket was unzipped, revealing the dark stain spreading across his side. He held a pistol in his right hand, but he didn't raise it. He just stood there, blocking the path, his breath coming in ragged clouds in the cold air. "Let her go," Dominic said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a tombstone. The fake marshals hesitated. They knew who he was, even wounded, even alone. Dominic Rinaldi was a legend in the streets of Harborview. He was the silent king. "Dominic?" Elena breathed. She stared at him. She'd convinced herself he was dead. She had spent 5 nights mourning him. And now, here he was, bleeding, feverish, and standing between her and hell. "He is alone," the man holding Elena shouted, his bravado cracking. "Drop the gun, Rinaldi, or I put a bullet in her spine." Dominic's eyes flickered to Elena. For a second, the old fear gripped her, the fear of the violence he carried, the fear of the world he belonged to. Then she saw his hands. They were trembling, not from fear, but from weakness. He was barely standing. He was dying on his feet to protect her. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't the monster. He never had been. He was just a man who loved her enough to bleed for her. Elena looked at the gunman, then back at Dominic. She straightened her spine. She took a step toward Dominic, ignoring the gun pressing into her back. "I am not afraid of you anymore," she said. Her voice was clear, steady, and loud in the echoing hallway. Dominic's eyes widened. He understood. She wasn't talking to the gunman. She was talking to him. She was telling him that she accepted him. The blood, the past, the danger, all of it. The declaration shocked the gunman. For a split second, their focus wavered, confused by the dynamic between the hostage and the savior. Dominic didn't waste the second. He raised his weapon and fired. The shot took the man on the left in the shoulder, spinning him around at the same moment. Elena moved. She didn't cower. She dropped her weight and lunged backward, driving her elbow into the gut of the man holding her. He grunted, his aim thrown wide as his gun discharged into the ceiling. Elena grabbed his wrist with both hands, twisting with all her strength, just as Dominic had shown her once in the kitchen of the safe house. Dominic closed the distance. He moved with a brutal, desperate speed. He didn't shoot the second man. He pistol-whipped him across the jaw, the sound of bone on metal sickeningly loud. The man crumpled. Dominic grabbed Elena, pulling her behind him, sweeping the hallway with his weapon. "Are you hurt?" he rasped, his eyes wild. "I am okay," she gasped, gripping the back of his jacket. "Dominic, you are bleeding." "I am fine." He lied, slow. Clap. The sound came from the loading dock doors at the end of the corridor. Marco Rinaldi stepped into the light. He was an older version of Dominic, wearing an expensive camel hair coat and holding a suppressed pistol. He was flanked by 3 more men. "Very touching," Marco said, his voice smooth and oily. "The nephew and the stray." "It is almost Shakespearean." Dominic straightened up. He pushed Elena further behind him, into the alcove of a support pillar. "It is over." "Marco," Dominic said, "the building is surrounded." "By whom?" Marco laughed. "The feds. I own half of them. You think you can walk out of here? You are weak. Dominic, you always were. Your father was weak, and you are just like him. Soft." He gestured to Elena. "That girl is your weakness. She is the reason you are standing here bleeding instead of sitting on the throne." Dominic looked at Marco. For years, he had sought this man's approval. For years, he had tried to be the ruthless soldier Marco wanted him to be. "No," Dominic said, his voice gaining strength. "She is not my weakness. She is the reason I am finally willing to end this." He didn't wait for Marco to monologue. He didn't wait for the signal. Dominic raised his gun. Marco fired. Dominic took the hit in his shoulder, jerking back, but he didn't fall. He fired back. He didn't aim for the head. He didn't aim for the heart. He aimed for the hand holding the gun. The bullet shattered Marco's wrist. Marco screamed, dropping his weapon. Before his men could return fire, the doors behind them exploded inward. Federal agents, led by Reynolds, swarmed the loading dock. Nate was with them, shouting orders. "Drop it! Federal agents!" Marco's men saw the odds. They dropped their weapons. Dominic stood there, swaying. His gun hung loosely in his hand. He looked at Marco, who was clutching his shattered wrist, whimpering on the ground. He could have killed him. He could have put a bullet in his uncle's head and ended the blood feud the way a Rinaldi was supposed to. Instead, Dominic engaged the safety on his pistol and set it on the ground. He reached into the inside pocket of his bloody jacket. He pulled out the black thumb drive. He handed it to Reynolds, who had rushed to his side. "It is all there," Dominic said, his voice barely a whisper. "The accounts, the names, the trafficking routes, Marco, the corrupt precinct, everything." Reynolds took the drive. He looked at Dominic with a strange mix of respect and pity. "You know what this means?" "Rinaldi?" Reynolds asked. "Even with this, you are going away." "I know," Dominic said. He turned to Elena. She was crying silently. She stepped out from the alcove and reached for him. "Dominic," she sobbed. He managed a weak smile. He reached out with his good hand, his bloody fingers brushing her cheek one last time. "I promised," he whispered, "a world where you don't have to look over your shoulder." Then his legs gave out. Elena caught him as he fell, sliding down to the concrete floor with him, holding him as the medics rushed in and the world faded to white. The visiting room at the FCI Danbury facility was quiet. It wasn't like in the movies with the glass partitions and the phones. It was a medium security room with tables bolted to the floor and guards watching from the perimeter. 8 months had passed. Elena sat at table 4. She wore a simple blue dress and Ryan's bracelet. She looked different, rested. The shadows under her eyes were gone. Dominic sat across from her. He wore a beige jumpsuit. He looked thinner. The sharp angles of his face more pronounced, but the tension that used to radiate off him was gone. The weight of the crown had been lifted. He placed his hands on the table. They were rough, calloused from working in the prison shop, but gentle. Elena reached out and covered them with hers. "How are you?" she asked. "I am surviving." Dominic said. His voice was soft. He looked at her with a hunger he tried to hide. Nate tells me the community center is open. It is. Elena smiled. We cut the ribbon last week. The grant money from the seized Rinaldi assets came through. We have 20 kids enrolled in the after-school program already. It is good work. Dominic's eyes crinkled at the corners. That is good. That is really good. He ran his thumb over her knuckles. 3 years, he said. With good behavior. Maybe 2. I can wait, Elena said immediately. Dominic pulled his hand back slightly. Elena, you don't have to. You have a life now. You are free. You don't need to be tied to a convict. Elena reached across the table. She grabbed his hand again, holding it tight. I am not tied to a convict, she said firmly. I am tied to the man who saved my life. I am tied to the man who burned down his own kingdom to keep me safe. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. I am not afraid of the time. Dominic, I am not going anywhere. Dominic looked at her. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in his life, he let himself believe in a future that didn't involve violence. Okay, he whispered. Okay. 2 years and 4 months later, the heavy steel gates of the facility buzzed and slid open. It was a bright, crisp autumn morning. The leaves on the trees lining the road were turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson. Elena stood by her car. She was wearing a heavy wool coat against the chill, her hands buried deep in her pockets. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, faster than it had ever beaten during the gunfights or the chases. A figure walked out of the gate. Dominic carried a single duffel bag. He wore jeans and a plain black jacket. He squinted against the sunlight, looking around uncertainly. He looked smaller without the entourage, without the expensive suit, without the aura of the king. He just looked like a man. He saw her. He stopped. Elena didn't wait. She ran. She crossed the distance between them and launched herself at him. Dominic dropped the bag and caught her, the impact knocking the wind out of him. He buried his face in her neck, his arms wrapping around her so tightly it hurt. They stood there for a long time, just holding on, breathing each other in. Let's go home, Elena whispered. Elena's apartment was small, the walls were thin, and the furniture was modest. It was a far cry from the penthouse or the lakeside cabin, but it was warm. They walked in, shutting the door on the world outside. Dominic stood in the center of the living room, looking around as if he were afraid to touch anything, as if his presence might stain the purity of her life. He looked at the photos on the mantel, Ryan, her friends, the kids at the center. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice vulnerable. I don't know how to be just Dominic. Elena walked over to him. She stood in front of him, reaching up to unzip his jacket. She peeled it off his shoulders and tossed it onto the chair. You just have to be here, she said. She placed her hand over his heart. She could feel it beating, strong, steady, alive. Are you sure? Dominic asked, searching her eyes. I am an ex-con. Elena, I have nothing to give you. The money is gone. The power is gone. I never wanted the money, Elena said, and I hated the power. She slid her hand up to cup his cheek, her thumb tracing the faint white line of the scar near his mouth. I wanted you. Dominic let out a ragged breath. He leaned into her touch, his eyes fluttering shut. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him. The movement was familiar, a muscle memory of comfort and desire that had survived the years of separation. Elena moved into his arms, lifting her face to his. He kissed her. It wasn't desperate like the rain, and it wasn't terrified like the cabin. It was slow. It was a promise kept. It was the taste of a second chance. They sank onto the small beige couch, limbs tangling together. Dominic pulled her into his lap, burying his face in the curve of her neck, breathing in the scent of her, vanilla and peace. Elena rested her head on his shoulder. Her hand splayed over his chest. She looked out the window at the city of Harborview. The sun was setting, painting the skyline in soft hues of orange and pink. The shadows were lengthening, but they didn't look dangerous anymore. I am not afraid, she whispered into the silence, her lips brushing the pulse point on his neck. Dominic tightened his hold on her, finally letting the last of the tension leave his body. Not of you, she continued softly, not of love, and not of the future. Dominic Rinaldi, the man who had once waited in the shadows to protect her, lifted his head. He looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes were completely clear. He kissed her forehead, settling back against the cushions, finally stepping fully into the light beside her. "Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said. Mafia Boss waited in the shadows to protect her. "I hope you enjoyed the journey of Elena and Dominic as much as I enjoyed writing it for you. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment down below letting me know where in the world you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel." If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to the Mafia Romance Stories channel so you never miss an upload. Don't forget to share your thoughts on the ending in the comments section. Did Dominic deserve his second chance? Let me know. Thank you for your support, and I will see you in the next story.